Government that failed, the founders tried again, the road to adoption of the U.S. Constitution. Roots of the U.S. Constitution can be traced throughout human history. In ancient history, Hammurabi was the first ruler to actually have a written set of laws, and in the Judeo-Christian heritage, the Ten Commandments provided a common moral code. Christianity provides a fairly common set of social norms, and taboos. Many of the framers of the Constitution were affected and mindful by the religious conflicts that occurred in Europe. And even though Christianity was popular, many of the framers were either agnostic or deist. The significance of the Ten Commandments and the influence of the Judeo-Christian heritage is that the framers, although they were part of a Christian nation, created a government that provided the people a lot of authority, even though it assumed the worst about human beings and mistrusted people in general. The Greek city-states influenced the Constitution with their belief in democracy and the philosophical framework from Aristotle that governments should desire to serve the public interest. The Roman Republic provided an example of a representative democracy with mistrust of a large landless class and a fear of popular revolt. The Romans also provided logistical ideas for how to rule a large land area in which most people were not near to the center of government. And it also provided the idea of a written set of laws that applied to all citizens equally, created sort of the idea of citizenship. The Magna Carta establishes the rule of law, and the rule of law is a form of government in which no power can be exercised except according to procedures, principles, and constraints contained in the law. So this essentially means that any citizen can find redress or addressing of complaints or violations of law made by government officials, no matter how powerful they happen to be. The Magna Carta serves as a first step towards a constitutional government in human history, and it provides a definition for powers of the government. That is very important. The Mayflower Compact of 1620 is the first American step toward constitutional government because it was the social compact or the social contract for the establishment of government between the people that were on the Mayflower before they left. And then the English Bill of Rights is not a constitutional declaration because it can still be modified by Parliament, which is the legislative body in the UK, but it continues the process of developing constitutional government by limiting the powers of the government so that the government cannot violate certain rights that are left specifically to the people. And then we come to European philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries. This is part of the Enlightenment. These are Enlightenment thinkers that discuss the idea of natural law, which is defined as law that binds men by virtue of their nature alone, not because it's written or conventional. So that's similar to Locke's state of nature. During the Enlightenment, these European philosophers looked at science as a solution, and so these philosophers rationalized and emphasized ration and reason over faith. Many of the assumptions made by the framers of the Constitution are based on the Enlightenment belief that humans are rational and that human nature can be understood and predicted. Some important Enlightenment thinkers include Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the book Leviathan in 1651. Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, every man is at war with everyone else, and in order to secure peace, men make contracts establishing sovereign power. So it's a very similar idea to Locke in saying that the state of nature is chaotic and men give up some of their freedoms via contracts, according to Hobbes, to provide some sort of authority. Hobbes said that there are three kinds of sovereign power. You have the monarchy, the aristocracy, and democracy. And Hobbes also argued that monarchy is the best form of government because he believed that it was the most stable and preserved the peace. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract in 1762. He argued that to make cooperation in society possible, men enter into social contracts and create states. And states derive their authority from the will of the people and are ruled by the consent of the people, which has been highly influential in American government. Rousseau also argued that the state exists to safeguard its citizens, to protect its citizens, and to promote the general will, or sort of the idea of majority rules. The ideal government, according to Rousseau, would be a small elected group, and the ideal state or nation is small enough to allow citizens to know one another. In the early years of the colonies, Great Britain followed the economic theory of mercantilism, in which it sought to increase its wealth by exporting more goods than it imported. It set very strict import and export controls over the colonies, and due to the distances involved, it was very difficult for Britain to enforce all of these policies, so they pretty much ignored the colonists. This is known as salutary neglect. After the French and Indian War, which was fought on behalf of the colonists in North America and also between England and France, or Britain and France, on the European continent, Britain attained quite a lot of debt, and so along with that debt, they obtained a vast expanse of territory in North America with lots of war debt. And so the British Parliament passed a series of taxes to pay for the cost of defending their colonies in North America, and also began to tighten the enforcement of its trade regulations. The American colonists resented these new taxes because they had no direct representation in Parliament, and so that's where they began saying no taxation without representation. In response to this, the colonists formed the First Continental Congress in September of 1774 and sent the delegates from each colony to Philadelphia to discuss the future relations with Great Britain. As a result, they sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III. At the First Continental Congress, the influence of Enlightenment thinkers, particularly John Locke, was very much evident. And just a couple of ideas that are worth noting from Locke over and over again is that Locke's philosophy is based upon a belief in natural rights, that people voluntarily give up some of their natural rights to form governments, and that the sole purpose of government is to protect those natural rights. Locke also believes, in an extreme case, people have the right to revolt against a government that no longer has their consent. Which brings us to the Declaration of Independence. So the Continental Congress met almost continuously during 1775 and 1776, and in May and June of 1776, they began to debate resolutions about independence. They began to seriously consider this. After 2 days of debate on the wording, they ratified and signed the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and in the document we can note several close parallels between Locke's thoughts and Jefferson's language. First, the sanctity of property was one of the few ideas absent in Jefferson's draft about the Declaration. Locke references life, liberty, and property, where Jefferson rephrases that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Revolution was a very conservative revolution because it did not drastically alter the colonist way of life, and essentially most of the people that had political authority in the colonies before it became an independent nation were the same people. So Thomas Jefferson was a key player in framing the Constitution, writing the Declaration of Independence, and then after the United States becomes the United States, he's a representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and then he's also eventually becomes president. So there's not a big transfer of power from one group to another. So it's considered to be a very conservative revolution because the primary goal of the revolution was to restore the rights colonists believe were already theirs as British subjects. The Articles of Confederation is the first government adopted by the newly independent United States, and it's established a government that's dominated by the states. So the Articles of Confederation established a national legislature they referred to as the Continental Congress with one house. It was very, very weak with very little authority. States could send up to 7 delegates to the Continental Congress, but each state only had 1 vote. The Continental Congress had very few powers outside of maintaining an army and a navy, very little money to even do that. It had no power to tax. It could not regulate trade, and that prevented foreign trade and the development of a strong national economy. In order to do anything, in order for any law to be passed or action to be taken, there had to be a unanimous movement of all the states, or a unanimous vote of all the states. And so economic turmoil results in part due to the weak national government that they create. The newly created United States ends up in a post-war depression, which leaves most small farmers unable to pay their debts, and many were threatened with mortgage foreclosures or losing their farms, which was also their livelihood. State legislators were now under control of people who were more sympathetic to the debtors, and a few states, including Rhode Island, adopted policies to help debtors, favoring them over creditors. All states printed their own paper money, and some states passed force acts requiring creditors to accept the almost worthless money. Shays' Rebellion is a demonstration of just how bad this economic turmoil becomes. In 1786, a small group of farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Captain Daniel Shays, rebelled at losing their land to their creditors. Shays' Rebellion was a series of armed attacks on courthouses aimed to prevent judges from foreclosing on farms. The most significant thing about Shays' Rebellion is that it becomes sort of the catalyst, the one event that becomes a changing point, where the framers or the political leaders at that time realized the Articles of Confederation is not going to work. The aborted Annapolis meeting is that they are going to, the founders were going to meet in Annapolis. They were going to send representatives from each state. They were going to work on the Articles of Confederation. Nobody showed up, essentially. I mean, 3 people, 3 representatives, 3 states did, but nobody showed up. The U.S. Constitution results from a series of compromises made by the framers, including compromises over representation, issues involving large and small states, slavery, and how to determine the population. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention will also make compromises on how members of each branch of government are going to be selected, and they create the Electoral College to give states a role in the selection of the president. Some of the characteristics of the gentlemen in Philadelphia is that they were all property-owning white men, relatively educated for this particular time period, and most had professions including lawyers, doctors, and some bankers. All of them were very young except for the 81-year-old Ben Franklin. Half of the gentlemen in Philadelphia were slave owners. Several plans for the new government were presented at the Constitutional Convention. The Virginia Plan, which was written by James Madison, called for a national system where the national government derives its powers from the people and not from member states. The key features included the creation of a powerful central government with 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, a 2-house legislature. One house would be elected directly by the people. The other house would be chosen from among persons nominated by the state. And finally, a legislature with the power to select the executive and the judiciary. The smaller states were not okay with this, and they came up with the New Jersey Plan, which key features included strengthening the Articles, not replacing them, creating a 1-house legislature with 1 vote for each state with representatives chosen by the state legislatures, and giving Congress the power to raise revenue from duties on imports and from postal service fees. The New Jersey Plan also proposed creating a Supreme Court with members appointed for life by the executive orders. What ends up being ratified is the current system of government that we have now.